Man accused of killing 29-year-old hiker Lauren Heike has officially been indicted. We'll get into the latest with legendary former homicide detective Fil Waters. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. So 22-year-old Zion William Teasley has been indicted by an Arizona grand jury on one count of first-degree murder for the killing of 29-year-old Lauren Heike. The hiker's body was found on April 29th with 15 stab wounds. Her body was found near a hiking trail not very far from her home. Teasley was arrested shortly after, and there is so much now to talk about with this case. So I want to bring in legendary former homicide detective Fil Waters to discuss a little bit more about this. Phil, thanks so much for taking the time. It's good to see you. Not a surprise, right, that the grand jury came back with an indictment against Teasley?
No, not a surprise at all. The only thing I am have looked at in the indictment itself is and this is not uncommon, but the lack of detail in the it's just the basic probable cause. This is what he did. This is what we've indicted him for.
Yeah. So, in other words, we don't know the motive. What investigators have said, and I'm curious why you think they've said this, is it appears to be a random, unprovoked attack. Now, why would they assume that unless you think they've spoken to the defendant?
Well, I would imagine they have tried. I don't know whether or not. Of course, this has been not a lot of details coming out on this particular case, so we don't know if he submitted to an interview and perhaps talked about why he did what he did and made an admission to it and a confession. So we don't know those details. I would presume that at the beginning of this thing, when they talked about this being a random attack, um, that word random is pretty broad based. So I just have a hard time given the viciousness of the attack and given the fact that it looks like he pursued her. There are all sorts of details about her climbing over a fence that they and
Yeah,
so forth and
let,
so on.
let me
He was
let, let
off
me
the
let me
trail.
amp, let me amplify that a little bit. So
Yeah.
she was apparently attacked from behind, stabbed 15 times. There are defensive wounds, and there is indication that she may have been chased through barbed wire. What does that tell you?
Well, you know, it doesn't appear to me to be random. I will put it that way. And of course, the detectives know better than I because they have all the details. But just from the outside looking in and drawing from the scope of my experience, this does not look to me to be a random attack. It looks like that and again, this is just my opinion, that he may have seen her at some place before, may have seen Lauren somewhere before, and we don't know. We know that she lived in an apartment complex somewhere close to that trail. We know that he was apprehended in an apartment complex relatively close to that trail. So we don't know at this point whether they lived in the same apartment complex or if he is in a place where he had seen her before and decided that that was something that he wanted to pursue. So
Hmm.
again, and when this thing details start to come out, we'll know better. But it doesn't appear to me to be a random attack. It appears to me to be something that he went prepared to commit.
And one of the most shocking details of it, other than the level of attack and brutality, is it happened in the middle of or the morning, like in the light hours, not at 2 o'clock in the morning or 11 o'clock at night. And that level of attack in broad daylight is very, very scary to think about. One of the things that I've been thinking about, Phil, is do you think that behind the scenes there are talks where, hey, if we can agree, if we can get him to confess and explain what happened, maybe we can work out some sort of deal? Because I am curious, and never saving everybody the time and expense of a trial, you obviously would want the defendant to plead guilty. Do you think that investigators are trying to get that level of detail from him? Now, obviously, if he's lawyer, his lawyer will not allow him to speak without his without him signing off on it and without the lawyer consulting with him about it. But how important do you think a confession would be here and an explanation of what happened?
Well, confessions are always important. In fact, there was never a case that I was involved in where I always gave the suspect the opportunity to an interview to speak to me. And so, if that was done, of course, then and he did provide some details, then that's going to be very important to the prosecution. And remember that in the scope of that part of the investigation, detectives are not in a position to offer any kind of deals. So this is going to be something the prosecutors will consider later. But we got to remember this is a death penalty case, and the only negotiation I would see, depending on how strong their case is, and I think they've got a pretty strong case, is going to be trying to negotiate getting him out of that death penalty consideration. So, and that may be the bargaining chip. You explain to us why you did what you did, because the evidence here is overwhelming that you did it, and then that's a discussion between he and his attorney on whether or not they want to pursue that.
Possibly. The evidence is overwhelming. We don't know all the details. Our understanding is that they used DNA evidence and surveillance video to connect him to the case. There was this snapshot of a surveillance video of somebody running, and I think it was identified that he was the person. Obviously,
Right.
defense attorneys could try to strike on that any which way. And just because a grand jury indicted him doesn't mean that a prosecutor would be able to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed this crime. Although DNA evidence and surveillance video is pretty strong. There's another aspect of this
I've
case I
also
wanted to
I've
get.
also read
Yeah,
that they do have some cellular phone data. So
that's correct.
uh,
Yeah,
they've got there are several, and that snapshot of that video, that's not all the video. So I think I just reading what I've read and how quickly they got a hold of this guy and have now indicted him. To me, it shows me that, and again, my opinion, but they've got some evidence. They've got some pretty strong evidence. They've got some pretty strong affirmative links to this guy. And remember that the indictment is only they have probable cause to indict this person. And you're right, Jesse. I mean, now we go to the trial phase, and it's going to have to be prosecuted and
yep.
found guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. So, this is just part of the process. But I would say that what I've read about, uh, it's pretty strong physical forensic evidence.
I wanted to also ask you about the fact that the defendant, Mr. Teasley, has had quite the record. So apparently, the Arizona Department of Corrections records show that he served 16 months in a state prison for armed robbery and other felonies, and he was released in November 2020. I find that to be a fascinating point because, in your experience, I'm curious, how often do we see repeat offenders? Because I know there's a stigma, against ex-cons that they're going to automatically commit more crimes, and we don't want that stigma. But at the same time, in your experience, how often do these ex-cons actually commit another felony such as this?
Well, recidivism has always been a problem. It's always been at a high rate, and there's no magic solution to that type of thing. And it all comes back to the individual, of course, of whether or not they're deciding they're going to turn their lives around or whether they're going to continue on with their criminal activity. And this is one of these cases, and I never speak these people's names. So this particular evildoer, this was, if we talk about the old saying about if we don't pay attention to history, we're doomed to repeat it. Well, here you go. I mean, this is the guy. This is so. I'm curious to know. I don't know what the overall sentencing was, and he only spent this amount of time, and so forth and so on. But he's got a history of this kind of stuff. And my question is why isn't he in prison on the day that this happened? Why wasn't he in prison? So is this one of these things where he had some good time, or he was eligible for parole and they paroled him? I mean, I don't know what the mechanics are behind his particular cases, but my sense is this guy should have been in prison on that day, and he wasn't. And he got out, and it didn't take him very long to continue on with his criminal activity. So he's going to be what I would refer to as a career correctional employee.
Yeah, he had been given an early release with probation for that armed
Yeah.
robbery, and less than 6 months before the crime was committed or allegedly committed here by him. Just another thing to think about. Fil Waters,
Failure.
thank you so much for taking the time.
You bet. Anytime, Jesse.
And that's all we have for you here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. I'll speak to you next time.